Hello, YouTube. Um, so I've been watching conference reports videos on uh, fundamentalism and the sort of substance metaphors that are tied to it. Um, it's really fascinating discussion. These last 4 or 5 videos have been unpacking this idea, which is really cool. Um, and I also briefly had a conversation with Piro about first principles. Um, and a few other places I've encountered sort of repeatedly again and again this question of first principles. Um, and I think that this is there's a really difficult problem at work, right? And I think that the difficult problem at work is that we forget when talking about, I don't know, when we talk about physics or something. Um, what is physics? I think that if we can answer that question in 2 ways. We can answer that question internally. That is, we can give an answer that's governed by the internal logic of the hard sciences. We can give an answer that is external to it. The internal answer that I would give is that physics is a description, a normative description of the structures of the world and movement, described mathematically and blah blah blah. The world is out there, and we can learn something about it through various techniques, the scientific method, and such. So that's an internal description of the way physics works. The external description of the way physics works is that physics would be a discourse, a project that human beings have undertaken to construct a picture of nature. Now, I think that those two different pictures of what physics is are both true. But I think that even though they're in contradiction, right? And I want to sort of unpack this a little bit further, and actually I'll contrast physics to, let's say, sociology, right? Because this is important. So physics, the world is out there. It's in shadow, and we can cast light on it and slowly uncover that which is in shadow. Sociology, on the other hand, that viewpoint is methodologically detrimental, right? The sociologist, in the interest of dispassion, right? The sociologist wouldn't want to assume that this culture or that culture had X, Y, or Z right? Rather, they would want to give an analysis of the internal workings of that culture. So, I think methodologically, sociology is kind of bound to reject the idea that there is one world out there that is describable and that we try to correspond to, right? And instead has to look at everything as discourses that are immanent to human beings rather than corresponding to something outside human beings. So we get two different pictures of the world, two different, in fact, I would say almost mutually exclusive pictures of the world. Now, the question that I want to raise about first principles, I guess you could say, is to what extent is it coherent to say that there must be some set of first principles that is independent of the discourse that they define, right? So, the picture of the world that's implied by the sciences is necessary vis-a-vis the methodology that's being employed in the natural sciences, and that's very useful, of course. Science, it works, bitches. I'm there with you. Whereas sociology has a mutually exclusive one, but in the name of sort of dispassion, in the name of through cultural analysis, we reject that picture of the world methodologically. Different first principles are at work. I don't know. I don't think that. I think the fundamentalist that ConferenceReport is trying to sketch out is the person who believes that, independent of what language game we're in, right? Independent of what conversation we're having, there is some unifying set of ideas that can be applied sort of everywhere. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not sure that the picture of the world that's implied by the physicists necessarily makes sense in other conversations. Another way to think about this is that take the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction is extremely applicable given the right context, given the right discourses, given the right conversation. But I don't think that we expect a poet to abide by that law, because it's a very different project. Everything about the poet is doing something different than the physicist is doing, or something like that. I think that with this sort of rise of the new atheism, as I've talked about previously, and you see this also in analytic philosophy, and you see it in the hard sciences, there's sort of this assumption at work that of the primacy, I guess you could say, of one set of norms for understanding the world over all others, right? Science is the real conversation. And this is where you get the sort of dismissive attitude towards the soft sciences. Now, I would critique this idea of the primacy of the sciences, not so much factually, but I would critique it in the way that there are two different again, there are two different projects here, and Marx has a really famous line where he says something like, up until now philosophers have merely tried to describe the world, the point is to change it, right? And regardless of your feelings on Marx or Marxism, Marx did change the world. So, in some way, there's the issue of descriptive versus proscriptive means of thought. I think that when undergoing a project of trying to describe the world, we assume that there is one reality. If, on the other hand, we are trying to change the world, then I think that it is in our interest to look at everything as much more malleable. So I'm not trying to describe, if I'm trying to transform myself in some way, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to merely describe myself. It's not I exist and I'm trying to articulate what I am, but rather I'm trying to re-articulate what I am, right? The same could be said about politics. The idea of attempting to change a political system is not, I don't think, necessarily rooted in a description of how a political system functions, so much as it is an issue of producing a new narrative, right? So it's been said before about Marx that his description of the proletariat as the wretched of the earth who will one day inherit the earth and blah blah blah. This sort of very Christian notion of parousia that's present in Marx. That what that is not so much a description of how things are, but rather he's creating a new narrative, right, that a society can latch onto and hold and cleave to, and that is compelling to us existentially. The kind of narrative that people will fight and die for, right? That will bind movements together and mobilize things. But it's a fiction, right? It's a fiction in the sense that it's not description of the world as it exists. So in this sense, I would say that the production of new fictions about what the world is, how the world is, who we are, how we are, etc., is necessary in terms of transforming the world and transforming ourselves. That act requires make-believe, and that's an act that requires a make-believe that goes beyond the concrete, pragmatic realities of the situation that might be unpacked by the scientific picture of the world. So, in my mind, I don't think that there is a reason to privilege one set of axioms that are required for a discourse like physics to take place, or a different set of axioms that are required for a discourse like sociology to take place, or a different set of axioms that are required for existential phenomenology to take place or something, or mathematics to take place, or these different sort of zones. And I know things are much, much more complex than this, but these different sort of zones of discourse and conversation take different sets of axioms, require different pictures of the world, and get different results. And for me, I guess I would say that it's already an error to assume with Sam Harris, right, that ethics can be reduced to science, or like that everything can be reduced to science somehow, can be reduced, can be co-opted within that methodology. On the other hand, it's a mistake to assume, along with the most radical postmodernists, I guess you could say, that the methods of the social sciences, the methods of certain philosophical gestures and assumptions and blah, 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 that everything can be reduced to them, and that therefore these other discourses are relativized, right? They don't represent anything real. The question is, how can we have both? Right? How can we accept and affirm the reality of something like physics without rejecting all other discourses, right? Or saying that everything else is garbage, or some other discourse, right? doesn't have to be physics that it's associated with. How do we accept the reality of something while rejecting the primacy of it, right? This is what's the serious work, and everything else is less important. I think that there's a kind of aporia there, and I think that that might. I think not wrestling with that, and to think that that's an easy question, is what my account of fundamentalism would be. In your sense, Conference Report. Thank you. Have a good day.